welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In the series on religion and society, which is a part of the syllabus of first year, second semester, BA Multidisciplinary Discourse, we are referring to the reading by Peter Berger on the Sacred Canopy. And here in Appendix 2 of the book, Peter Berger is helping us to understand the sociological and theological perspective to understanding a religion. So, Berger asserts that strict methodological autonomy for sociology. Berger denies anti-theological bias, rejecting dialogue with the theologian answers empirical questions or vice versa. Sociology operates in empirical frame. It queries, demands sociological responses. Theological insight may inform faith reflexivity, but sociology stands alone, just solely on theoretical merit, immune to normative critique. Berger anticipates a common critique that a sociological analysis of religion is secretly an attempt to debunk or attack faith. He assures the reader that there are no anti-theological implications hidden beneath the surface. And that is what kind of takes us to the understanding where it is possible, whether it is possible to have a value neutral study of the religion. And therefore, he begins by doing away with these assumptions that studying religion would be attacking a particular faith or critiquing a particular faith. So, by treating religion as humanly constructed universe, he is not saying that the divine reality doesn't exist. He is simply saying that the divine reality is not something a sociologist can observe or measure. Thus, Berger enforced disciplinary boundaries, echoing positivist root while enabling a secular analysis of religion. And this is kind of termed as methodological atheism. Berger is practicing what is often called methodological atheism. This doesn't mean the researcher is an atheist in their private life. Rather, it means that for the sake of research, they must act as if the sacred is purely a human product. So, you need to study religion just as you would study the market or you study marriage. So, you cannot necessarily associate it with a particular faith of an individual or a belief of an individual and kind of negating from the idea that studying religion implies that we are atheist. Sociological theory is an empirical discipline based on observation, whereas theology is a normative discipline based on what ought to be or what is divinely revealed. So, basically a theologists are trying to understand how much of the norms have been followed by the believer in a particular faith, whereas the sociologists are not judging, they are not evaluating the practice or the faith of individual. They are only studying the way it is being practiced by the individuals or members of a society. So, one cannot answer a sociological question, for example, how does this ritual create social cohesion, with a theological answer, because God commanded it. They are two different languages that cannot solve each other's problem. Berger dismisses a popular idea of his time that a sociologist and theologians should be partners in dialogue, where the sociologist points out problem and the theologians provides the answer. He calls this a methodological platitude to assume they are playing the same game. With a theologian might find sociological insight useful for their own work, they might translate those findings into their own religious language. The sociologist, as a scientist, cannot follow them into their territory. His argument stands or falls as an enterprise of sociological theorizing. If a theologian hates his book, it doesn't mean the book is wrong. It is just means the theologian is using a different yardstick. So, the methodological atheism is compared with atheism tout quote. So, methodological atheism means to do sociology, one must assume that religion is a human projection. If you explain a social event by saying God caused it, you have stopped doing sociology and started doing theology. So, atheism tout quote or simple atheism means the belief that God does not exist. Berger argues that just because a sociologist explains religion as a human projection, it doesn't mean that the projection doesn't point to something real. A map is a human projection of a mountain. The mountain still exists independently of the map. So, a religious study is just a projection of a belief or a practice. Religion continues to exist independent of the theory. So, what are the key theoretical distinctions between the ways in which sociologists study religion? Berger uses two Latin phrases to define the boundaries of his work. First is sub specie temporis. It means under the aspect of time. This is a sociological lens, meaning treating religion as a human projection. It looks at history, social structure, and human activity. It sees religion as something that changes, develops, and is made by people. The second theme is subspecie eternitas, which means under the aspect of eternity. This is a theological or a metaphysical lens. It looks at ultimate truth. When Berger refers to man bites dog feet, he is using a journalism metaphor for something unexpected. Usually, sociology reduces theology to anthropology. It says God is just a human idea. He is suggesting the reverse, that if we look closely at anthropology, the nature of man, we might find that man is wired to see God because God is real. He calls this a reconstruction of anthropology in theological mode, though he clarifies that as a sociologist he cannot perform that feat himself. He can only point to the door and let the theologian walk through it. Then, besides comparing it with the anthropology, he seeks a parallel in the science, physical science, specifically mathematics. Berger argues that modern mathematics and science also have human origin. We can trace the historical infrastructure, the specific social and economic conditions that allowed calculus of physics to develop. Just because we know why and when human developed the concept of number zero or the theory of relativity doesn't mean those concepts are illusions. Similarly, if a sociologist shows that a specific religious doctrine emerged because of certain social pressure, that doesn't automatically mean the doctrine isn't true in an ultimate sense. So, then the question that he raises, Peter Berger raises is, then when should the theologist worry? While Berger offers a shield to theologian by saying the ultimate truths are subspecie eternitas, that is beyond time, he is also issuing a stern warning. Theology is only immune if it stays in its own lane. He identifies two areas which sociology can injure the theological position. If a religion claims that faith always makes people physically healthier or religious society have lower crime rates, these are testable propositions. If the sociological data shows the opposite, the theologian has a problem. He compares the sociologist to the historian. If a theology is built on a specific historical event, that is, Exodus or the resurrection, and a historian proves that event never happened or happened differently, the discrepant frames of reference can no longer protect the theology. Berger is proposing a truce between the scientist and the believer. The scientist agrees not to claim the disproved God, and the believer agrees not to make claims about the physical or historical world that contradict empirical evidence. Berger notes that some religions are more immune than others. If a religion is purely mystical or philosophical, that is based on timeless ideas, sociology can't touch it easily. However, Judaism and Christianity claimed that God acted in history. For example, the Exodus, the Convent, the incarnations, these are kind of historical events or point of time when it was believed that the gods were kind of performing. So, Berger argues that because these faiths are radically historical, meaning they base their truth on specific events happening to specific people at specific time, they are uniquely vulnerable to sociological and historical critique. Then he moves from historical understanding to the trap of religious market research. Peter Berger mocks a tame version of sociology that was and still is popular in church organization. And he says the harmless sociology. This is when a church hires a researcher to count how many people are in pews, what the demographic is, or how to market the church better. Berger calls this religious market research. And then he calls the second is the dangerous sociology. This is what Peter Berger is doing in his work, The Sacred Canopy. It doesn't just count the people in the pews, it asks why pews exist at all. It looks at overall activity and might conclude that the church is just a human mechanism for maintaining order, that is the nomos, rather than a divine institution. Berger is telling the churchman or the theologian, don't invite sociology into your house if you wanted to clean the floors. If you use sociological tools, you might start to see your entire religious world as a projection. You might realize that what you thought was a sacred reality is actually a socially constructed one. So then he kind of comes to the idea of the Magna Questia or the Great Question. He defines the central problem for both the historian and the sociologist as the problem of relativity. If every belief is a product of its time and social infrastructure, how do we find an Archimedean point, a solid, unmoving ground from which we can judge what is true? For example, if you are a Christian because you were raised in a 20th century American suburb and infrastructure, and your neighbor is a Buddhist because they were raised in 20th century Thailand, sociology suggests both beliefs are products. Berger then uses the term social engineering to describe how plausibility is created. We believe things because the people around us believed them and because our social structure reinforces them. So, if we are born into a particular community and we are socialized into the norms of a particular belief or a faith, then it is the entire belief or faith is a social construction. So, we are kind of being influenced by the ideas circulated around us and the social structure reinforcing those ideas. So, the habit of belief, he cites Thomas Aquinas, who feared his faith was just a habit of his environment rather than a response to God. And then he talks about the new virulence. While these doubts are old, Berger argues that sociology makes them virulent. Virulent means toxic or intense. And why do they become virulent? Because it provides a map of exactly how those habits are built. It explains away the mystery. Earlier, Berger said that theology and sociology occupy different frames. Now he admits that this is a cold comfort. And what is the problem? The problem is that they are different frames. Argument only works if you already have a strong faith. If you are searching for truth and sociology shows you that all truth claims are socially constructed, you suffer from vertigo. You feel like you are spinning in a void of relativity when no single projection is more valid than the other. So, there are three theological responses, and Berger categorizes theologians based on how they handle the realization that religion is a human product. The first is the innocent orthodox. These thinkers simply ignore the problem. They haven't felt the vertigo yet. They continue as if their doctrines are objective fact, unaffected by the historical or social shift. Berger hints that this can sometimes be more wise, that is, bad faith, a self deception where one pretends not to see the relativity of their position. The second theological response from the radical liberals. These thinkers have fully succumbed to the vertigo. They have essentially given up on finding an absolute truth and have moved towards a secularized theology that abandons traditional supernatural claim. And the third theological response is the neo-orthodox, the cake and eat it too group. This is the most intellectually complex group. They accept all the sociological and historical critique of religion, but then claim that their faith is something else entirely. So, then after looking into the response, theological response, Weber highlights a distinction between religion and faith. He uses a rhetoric move made by theological Karl Barth. They performed a surgical split to save Christianity from sociologists. And in that, they kind of helped us to understand religion, the human side. They agree with Berger. They admit that religion is a human projection, a psychological crutch, and a social construct. They throw this to the Cerberus. And who's the Cerberus? The multi-headed dog guarding the underworld. And so this kind of understanding of a sociological analysis is not possible. The second category is the faith or the word or the divine side. They claim that while religion is man's attempt to reach God, revelation is God's attempt to reach man. Because this comes from outside the human system, they argue it is immune to sociological relativity. By separating religion, a human mess, from the word, a divine absolute, these theologians created a safe space to work. Karl Barth could analyze Feuerbach's critique of religion and agree with it completely while still being a devout Christian. Rudolf Bultmann could demythologize the Bible, stripping away the ancient scientific impossible projection to find the core Krigman, the essential message that remains true regardless of social context. Dietrich Bonhoeffer spoke of a religionless Christianity, suggesting a way to live as a Christian in a world that no longer needed the protective canopy of traditional religious institutions. Berger is skeptical of whether one can truly separate the divine word from the human language and culture used to speak it. Berger notes that mystics have their own version of neo-orthodox maneuver. By claiming that God is fundamentally unknowable and unthinkable, they protect the Godhead from sociology. If you say, everything I think about God is not actually God, then the sociologist can only analyze your thought, which you have already admitted are irrelevant. The crow truth remains immune because it sits outside the realm of human language and social construction. So, what is Berger's retraction? Berger makes a surprisingly personal admission here. He mentions his own previous world, the precarious vision, where he once tried to use the neo orthodox faith versus religion distinction. He now calls that distinction inadmissible. He argues that Christian faith doesn't get a special pass. When you look at it through a microscope, it has the same social structure, the same psychological pattern, and the same historical relativity as any other religion. This is the heart of Berger's intellectual critique. A claim made before looking at the evidence, example, I assume the work of God is true, therefore it is immune to sociology. Knowledge gained after looking at the evidence, for example, I see that this faith is practiced by people in a social group, therefore it is a social phenomena. Berger says he cannot simply launch theological a prioris to save himself from the vertigo of relativity. He argues that if you accept the sociological reality that Christianity is a human projection maintained by plausibility generating social groups, you lose two psychological comfort. First is the leap of faith. You can no longer just leap into a commitment and pretend the social machinery isn't there. And the second, the radical negation. You can't just say it is fake and walk away, because even the secular world you walk into is also a human projection, just like religion. Instead, the theologian is left with a grueling manual task, evaluating every single traditional affirmation one by one to see if it holds truth. Berger clarifies that he just isn't reviving the content of 19th century liberalism. He acknowledges that their specific ideas are largely dead. However, Berger wants to salvage the spirit of that movement, the intellectual courage to look into the fact without flinching, and the willingness to be in a cognitive minority. So, what is the cognitive minority? It means holding a worldview that is not supported by the dominant plausibility structures of your society. In a secular world, the believer is a cognitive minority. In a religious institution, the honest scholar who admits religion is a projection is a cognitive minority. To be in a cognitive minority means that Berger ends up by placing the burden of truth back on the individual. If sociology can't prove God and theology can't hide from sociology, the only question left is this or that in the tradition true? To give you a sense of the vertigo, Berger is talking about consider how shifting infrastructure change what people find plausible. So, in the United States, where Berger wrote his book, the cognitive minority of the religious unaffiliated person has grown significantly, changing the sacred canopy of the nation. And then he gives us a historical idea of how this change has taken place. 1972, shortly after publication, only 5% of the Americans identified as none, that is, they were not affiliated to any church. The plausible structure for Christianity was overwhelming. By 2024, approximately 28% of Americans identified as none. As the numbers shift, the vertigo increases for those remaining in the tradition because the social reinforcement or the canopy is thinning. Berger calls for a theology that stops using subterfuge. He specifically calls out the distinction between history, that is the objective cold fact, and geste, that is the story or existential meaning of history. So, then the subterfuge, many theologians use this term to say the facts of history might be messy, but the meaning or the story is true. He argues you must accept the cold fact that religion is a human product without trying to hide behind linguistic tricks. You must start from the bottom. This is one of the Berger's most famous contribution to religious thought. He suggests that if we look at human projections, our art, our law, our religion long enough, we might find things that don't seem to come from our social circumstances alone. So, the projector, since we can't see God directly, we should study the human, the projector. Berger later defines these as a prototypical human gesture that points beyond the physical world, such as the human drive for order, the act to play, the hope of a parent for a child, or the outrage we feel at moral evil. These signals suggest that man is more than just a biological or a social machine. Berger concludes that sociology and theology should not be enemies but partners. However, this partnership requires a specific kind of person. So, this is the lecture is from the book The Sacred Canopy, and for reference it is advised to read Appendix 2, Sociological and Theological Perspective in Berger, The Sacred Canopy. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.